When I walked into the church that morning, the air shifted, not in any grand or theatrical way, but subtly like the sudden hush before a storm. Conversations dropped mid-sentence, eyes flicked toward me, and necks twisted in quiet disbelief. It had been 10 years since I'd seen most of them, but memory can be cruel in how it lingers. My name moved across pews like a cold draft, Leona Markham. Some whispered it with pity, others with quiet scorn. Martin Devellin lay in his casket, surrounded by roses as pale as the silence that greeted me. He looked exactly as I remembered, only stiller. Death has a way of making even the most complicated people seem simple. Tina, his second wife, sat in the front row with a tissue pressed to her cheek, though I never saw her wipe away a single tear. Beside her were my daughters, Jenna, poised and unreadable, and Harper, who looked everywhere but at me. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to bear witness. I slid into a pew near the back. I didn't want to disturb the image they had created, the new family neatly stitched together over the remnants of my life. I wasn't there to reclaim anything. Not love, not dignity, just the truth. And truth, I've learned, rarely walks in loud. The minister's voice began its gentle cadence, invoking memories I had no space left to hold. I stared straight ahead, but my mind walked backward through time and regret. Back to Charleston, to a modest apartment above a bookstore. To Martin in his thrift store suit and me with paint under my fingernails. He once said I smelled like turpentine and peaches. Our first Christmas tree was a crooked little thing we dragged 2 blocks because we couldn't afford delivery. We decorated it with popcorn and orange slices. I had never felt richer. Martin would hold my face with both hands and tell me I was magic. I used to believe him. Years passed in soft revolutions. His business grew, so did the walls between us. Somewhere between the PTA meetings and client dinners, I disappeared. Not all at once, not in flames, but slowly like daylight fading. He became a man with polished shoes and perfect excuses. I became the background. He stopped noticing the notes I tucked into his suitcase. He no longer asked about the paintings I hid in the laundry room. He laughed louder at parties, but never with me. I watched the version of Martin I loved evaporate into someone everyone admired and I no longer recognized. Still I stayed, out of love, I told myself, out of hope, out of duty, out of fear that if I left, no one would remember I'd been there at all. The final unraveling wasn't loud either. A night meant to celebrate his latest business award, a gala in a hotel ballroom. I wore the dress he once said made me glow. He introduced me to a group of investors as Leona, she keeps me sane, with a chuckle as though I were a personal assistant or an emotional support animal. They laughed. I smiled. My hand hovered midair, unshaken. On the drive home, I asked him quietly if he meant it. He didn't look up from his phone. It was a joke. Don't be so sensitive. That word again, sensitive, as if being hurt by being diminished made me irrational. After that night, I began to notice the changes more clearly. His cologne was different. His phone never left his side. He was charming to waitstaff but distant with me. I told myself it was work, that things would settle, that I was overthinking. I made his favorite dinner for our 30th anniversary. He didn't show, no call, no apology, just a tired excuse the next morning, and I still poured his coffee the way he liked it, no sugar, splash of cream. When he finally suggested I leave, he said it like he was talking about reorganizing furniture. Maybe it's time we took some space, he said, folding laundry, not even meeting my eye. I didn't argue. I nodded, walked into the kitchen. I remember how the tiles felt under my bare feet, cold, unfeeling. Packing was a quiet ritual. I took the things I had come into the marriage with, my brushes, my mother's cookbook, a worn cardigan I'd mended 6 times. I left the crystal, the china, the memories. Jenna said she saw it coming. Harper cried. I didn't explain. I couldn't. Their understanding had been shaped by what they were allowed to see, and Martin was good at hiding the cracks. In Savannah, I rented a small condo with carpet that curled at the edges and wallpaper peeling like old scabs. It was mine. The silence there was different, clean, honest. It didn't accuse, it didn't forget, it just let me exist. I got a part-time job at a dental office, filed insurance claims, answered phones, smiled through grief. I decorated my walls with second-hand art and pictures of the girls when they still wore matching barrettes. I started walking in the evenings, letting the wind remind me I was still here. The letter came months later, tucked in a box of my brother Ray's belongings. Ray, the only one who looked me in the eye after the divorce, who brought me groceries and left without expecting thanks, who once told me you were always more than just his wife. Inside the envelope, a letter from Martin, unsent, unsigned, but undeniably his. He wrote that he hadn't stopped loving me, that he'd stopped loving who he'd become, that my presence reminded him of the man he used to be, and that terrified him. He called me the best part of his life. I didn't cry. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I framed that letter not as a tribute, but as a marker. The moment I finally knew it wasn't me. It never was. And now, sitting in that church, watching Tina pretend to weep, hearing the lawyer shuffle forward with Martin's will, I felt nothing but a quiet strength, the kind built not from vindication but survival. And when the lawyer read my name aloud, Leona Markham, the room stopped breathing. I didn't flinch, I didn't speak, I just looked forward and waited. Because finally, it was time they heard the truth. It had been a week since the will reading, but the words still echoed in my mind like a bell that refused to go silent. I hadn't expected peace, not from a letter read aloud in front of the people who had once erased me with polite nods and cold glances, but there it was, creeping in like a dawn not yet visible but already warming the air. I returned to Charleston not with triumph, not with vengeance, but with quiet gravity. The taxi pulled up in front of the house I had once called home, a house I helped design, a garden I had once planted, and walls that once echoed with laughter and lullabies. 10 years had passed, and yet the bones of the place were the same. They remembered me even if the people didn't. The key turned with an ease that startled me. No resistance, no protest, just a quiet invitation. I stepped inside and paused at the threshold. The air inside was still, not stale but expectant, like the house had been waiting. Furniture had changed, the colors were no longer mine. Tina had tried to make it hers, velvet drapes instead of linen, abstract art where my landscapes had hung, chrome fixtures instead of the warm brass Martin and I once picked out together. But under the layers of someone else's taste, the soul of the place remained. The scuff marks on the baseboard from Harper's roller skates were still there. I walked through the house like one walks through a museum of a life that once was theirs, each room a frozen echo. In the master bedroom, the bed had a new headboard, taller, colder, but the window still opened to the same soft rustle of the oak tree just outside. The bathroom tile, blue and white, the ones I insisted on because they reminded me of Santorini, remained. In the closet, most of Tina's things were gone. Only a few wire hangers remained. On the top shelf, pushed far to the back, I found a box labeled Misk Leona. I took it down with cautious hands. Inside were fragments of the life I thought had vanished. A broken locket with a photo of Harper and Jenna as toddlers, one of my old journals with paint smudges on the cover, and a bundle of birthday cards Martin had never opened. The following morning, I began reclaiming the house in small acts. I removed the abstract art and leaned them gently against a wall in the garage. I found my old watercolors tucked behind a stack of unused canvases. I repotted the overwatered succulents in the kitchen. I baked a loaf of banana bread not because anyone would eat it, but because the scent made the house feel like mine again. There was no music, no grand statement, just silence filled with presence. 2 days later, I met with Dean Holloway again. The trust transfer was proceeding without issues. Tina's emergency injunction had been swiftly dismissed. According to court documents, Martin had left behind another surprise, a portfolio of investments hidden during the divorce, placed in accounts intended for our daughters but funded with marital assets never disclosed. "They're yours to claim," Dean had said, sliding over a folder with spreadsheets and statements. I didn't respond right away. It wasn't greed, it was grief or perhaps recognition. For years, I thought I'd left with nothing, that I'd walked away with only a name and a past. But now, here it was, the map of an empire I had helped build, buried under guilt and legal maneuvering. "I want part of it to go to a scholarship," I finally said, "for women over 50 who are trying to start again. Call it the Ray Markham Fund." Dean smiled. "Your brother would have liked that." "I think so too." And with that, the paperwork began. Quiet justice, silent restoration. I redecorated not with extravagance, but with intention. The Charleston house became more than a place to live, it became a place to create. I turned the sunroom into a studio. I opened its doors on weekends to a watercolor class for women who needed an outlet, a community, or simply a reason to show up somewhere that wasn't defined by someone else. The women who came were varied: widows, divorcees, teachers, caregivers, even a retired bus driver. They brought their pain, their memories, and slowly their laughter. We painted stories in blue and gold, told truths in brushstrokes, and learned that healing doesn't have to be loud. One afternoon, Harper showed up. She didn't call first, just knocked on the front door, a canvas tote over her shoulder and nervousness in her eyes. "I brought some paints," she said. I stepped aside. "Come in." We didn't speak much that day. She painted. I watched. At the end of the class, she lingered. "I'm sorry for not seeing you," she said, her voice small. "I know," I replied. She nodded. "Can I come next week?" "Always." It wasn't a reunion, it was a return, and it was enough. Jenna hadn't called. I didn't expect her to. Some people need longer to rewrite the stories they were told, and some never do. That I had come to accept. Instead, I focused on what was in front of me, the canvases, the students, the peace that had come, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped waiting for someone else to resolve it. At night, I sat by the window in the reading room I had created from the guest bedroom. The framed letter from Martin, Ray's photo, and my leather-bound journal sat on the side table. I would write not for legacy, not for validation, but for clarity. "You're still here," I would whisper, and I would believe it. I had no need for applause, no need for pity. I had reclaimed the space within myself. And with every sunrise over the Charleston skyline, with every paint-stained apron, every shared story around the studio table, I was rewriting my life, not as the woman who had been laughed at, erased, or forgotten, but as the woman who quietly endured, steadily rebuilt, and finally, joyfully began again. The day of the private family memorial arrived under a pale gray sky that seemed to hold its breath. Rain threatened but never fell. Charleston, with its wrought iron gates and ancient oaks, felt solemn, as if the city too mourned a story that had gone untold for far too long. The ceremony was small, as Martin had requested, only family, a few close friends, and a few associates from his old firm. The chapel was a modest white structure nestled beside a garden, and though I wore black, I did not wear grief like the others. My grief had already come and gone in waves for a decade. What remained was something different, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps completion. Tina wore a designer shawl and sunglasses too large for the weather. Her expression was carefully blank, but I noticed the tension in her jaw each time someone greeted me as Mrs. Markham. She stood beside Jenna, who hadn't said a word to me yet. I didn't expect her to. People can be raised in houses full of stories and still only inherit the lies. Harper stood alone near the garden, clutching a small bouquet of gardenias. Her presence was my anchor. She had come back not just to me, but to herself. We exchanged a small nod, and it was enough. After the service, people lingered in hushed clusters. I avoided the center, choosing instead to walk toward the old fountain behind the chapel, where Martin had once taken our daughters to feed ducks. I sat there in silence until I heard footsteps behind me. It was Ray's son, Daniel, mid-30s, gentle features, a calm spirit that reminded me so much of his father. He sat beside me without a word, then handed me an envelope. "My father wrote this before he passed," he said it belonged to you. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. The letter inside was handwritten in Ray's neat script. "Leona, if you're reading this, it means Martin finally did the right thing in the end, even if it took him too long to see you clearly. I loved him and I loved you too, in a way you may never fully understand, not because I wanted to cause pain, but because I saw in you what he forgot to cherish. You were never invisible, at least not to me. When you left, a part of our family left with you. I wanted to call, to write, to fix it, but Martin wouldn't allow it, and I wasn't brave enough to defy him. I hope this letter reaches you not as a wound reopened, but as a door slightly ajar. I hope you walk through it. You deserve every good thing that returns to you. Love always, Ray." I folded the letter gently and held it to my chest. Tears came not from pain, but from something lighter, a long-held ache finally finding its exhale. For so long, I had mourned not just the end of a marriage, but the silence of a friend I had once called brother. And now, even in death, he had spoken. I stood, thanked Daniel, and returned to the chapel, where the lawyer, Dean Holloway, was preparing to deliver a short closing remark. But before he did, he held up a small wooden box. "There's one final note," he said, looking directly at me. "Martin left individual letters for his immediate family. Per his instructions, I will now read the one addressed to Leona." Gasps fluttered, Tina visibly bristled. Dean opened the envelope and began. "Leona, if you're hearing this, it means I failed while alive to say what needed to be said. You were never meant to be the villain in our story, though I let others cast you that way. I listened to fear, to shame. I let pride drive my choices, and I lost the best parts of myself when I lost you. I gave Tina our house, but she never built a home in it. I gave her your garden, but she let it wither. I gave her my loyalty, but she never earned it. And still, none of that excuses me. I know you tried. I saw it in your paintings, your patience, your silence. I saw it too late. You are the keeper of what was good in me. I leave to you not just assets, but intention. Use them however you wish. I trust you. I always did. I just forgot how to show it. Tell our daughters I loved them. Tell them I failed you, not because you were unworthy, but because I was too blind to see what real strength looked like. Goodbye, Martins." The room was silent when the letter ended. I felt no triumph, only stillness. Tina turned sharply, her heels clicking out of the room. Jenna stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. I didn't wait for anyone to approach me. I walked out into the Charleston sunlight, the sky now breaking into soft blue. The world felt lighter, or maybe I did. That evening back at the house, I placed Ray's and Martin's letters side by side in a frame, not for public display, just for me, proof that even the most broken stories can leave behind pages of truth. As I sipped chamomile tea in the reading room, I heard the soft creak of the front door. Harper stepped inside, holding a notebook. "I wrote something," she said. She sat beside me and began to read. It was a poem, not just about loss, but about roots and rain and how things grow again after the burning. It was beautiful. "He would have loved it," I said. She smiled, so would Ray. And in that quiet house, under a sky that no longer threatened to break, we listened to the past without letting it own us. It was a quiet Thursday when I noticed the first shift in the air. Morning light entered the Charleston house differently, casting longer shadows through the foyer window, brushing the hallway floor like a memory trying to be seen. I had just finished placing a fresh vase of lilies in the dining room, a small ritual I had adopted every week, not for guests, but for myself. That day I stood in the center of the living room, barefoot on the wood I had once chosen for its warm tone. I let the silence surround me. It was not empty. It held traces of voices no longer here and steps no longer taken. It hummed with the knowledge of things unsaid. That house had heard it all, the slam of doors during our arguments, the late-night pacing after Martin had returned from long business trips, the quiet sobs into pillows so no one, not even my daughters, would hear. Houses, I've learned, are not just buildings, they're witnesses, and unlike people, they don't lie. Sometimes I'd wander into a room and feel a sharp, specific ache, like the wall itself remembered a betrayal I'd tried to forget. The study was the worst. That room had once been Martin's refuge, then became Tina's office. I had only walked past it in those years, never allowed in. Now it was empty, but its air still carried exclusion. One afternoon, I found a drawer in the study desk that had jammed. With some effort, I managed to pull it open. Inside, a single item lay forgotten, a printed photo, slightly bent. It was from a 4th of July years ago. Harper was about 12, Jenna maybe 9. They wore matching red bandanas. I stood behind them, smiling, one hand on each of their shoulders. Martin had taken the picture. I sat down and studied the image. My smile was real, but the eyes I could see now were tired, not just physically, spiritually. I remembered that day clearly. It had been a rare moment of peace, sandwiched between weeks of silence and thinly veiled tension. I had grilled corn on the back porch. Martin had disappeared halfway through to take a phone call. The girls had laughed when the fireworks began. I had pretended to enjoy them. That photo joined a small collection I had started. I called it Truths in Disguise. Little items unearthed from forgotten corners, receipts, notes, an old scarf with my perfume still faintly clinging to it. They weren't evidence of wrongdoing, just proof that I had once existed fully in this space. On Sunday, I visited the cemetery again. Martin's grave was still covered in fresh flowers, mostly from business associates, I imagined, people who had sent their condolences by email. I didn't kneel, just stood for a long while. I'm not here to forgive you, I thought, not in anger, but as a declaration. I'm here to remind both of us that I lived. In the following weeks, my watercolor classes gained momentum. We moved from color theory to painting memories. I asked the women to bring an object from their past and paint the story it held. One brought a baby shoe, another a cracked teacup. Harper, surprisingly, brought a pinecone from the yard of our old summer cabin. It was small and weathered. I found it in a box of winter scarves, she said quietly. I don't know why I kept it. You don't have to know, I said. Memory chooses us sometimes. That afternoon, Harper's brush moved slower than the others. She dabbed carefully, letting the shape emerge from washes of soft brown and green. When she finished, she didn't speak, just turned her canvas toward me. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. I nodded, she smiled. That night, I passed the guest bedroom, now my reading room, and saw the painting propped on the windowsill. She must have left it. I didn't move it. It belonged there now. There were still days when grief visited like a cold wind, unexpected, unwelcome. I would find myself staring at the garden, remembering how Martin had promised to plant magnolias and never did. Or I'd reach for a book and stumble across a note in his handwriting, brief, businesslike, but once meant for me. I didn't burn them, I didn't tear them up. I placed them in a box labeled then. One late afternoon, as golden light spilled across the kitchen counters, I brewed tea in the blue pot I hadn't used in years. Jenna's favorite. I almost expected her to walk in, but the house stayed still. I poured 2 cups anyway and sat across from the empty chair. Maybe one day, I whispered, not as a hope, just as a note to time. Some evenings, I lit a candle on the porch and wrote long letters to no one in particular. I told the wind what I had learned. That healing wasn't a destination, that silence could be kind, that sometimes we survive not because we are strong, but because we are willing to feel the weakness and keep moving anyway. I did not send these letters. I placed them in a jar and buried them beneath the camellia bush. Charleston bloomed around me, the market square buzzed again, children biked past my gate, life continued as it should. And in a house that had once gone mute with neglect, music returned not in songs but in the rhythm of daily grace, the clink of teacups, the rustle of aprons, the quiet giggle of women rediscovering joy through paint. What they had taken from me, my place, my voice, my dignity, I had found not in court victories but in presence, in the stillness of acceptance, in the power of not needing revenge to feel whole. There were mornings when I still woke up forgetting where I was. The filtered light from the linen curtains looked like the past. For a second I was 34 again, with a family to feed and a school run to make. But then the air shifted and the quiet reminded me this was after the undoing, the silence, the re-entry. The studio had grown in ways I never expected. What began as a watercolor group of 5 had turned into a weekly circle of 12, sometimes 15. We stopped needing words. The hush of concentration, the scrape of brushes, the hum of old jazz from a small speaker in the corner, it was enough. Most of the women never asked me what had happened. They just showed up like I did. They brought their stories in their hands, not their mouths. That was all I needed. One woman, Lorraine, came every Tuesday without fail. She never painted, only sketched with pencil and charcoal. She was 72, a retired midwife with gnarled fingers and eyes like wet glass. She once drew the same face 3 weeks in a row, a woman with her mouth half open, like she just remembered something she couldn't say aloud. She was me before, Lorraine replied, that was all. I never asked again. Meanwhile, the rest of the estate settled. The media buzzed briefly, a few society blogs noting Martin's hidden generosity or speculating on the changed beneficiaries, but Charleston's attention span was short. Tina attempted a last appeal, which the court denied. Jenna still hadn't called. I no longer checked the phone expecting her name. Instead, I focused on the house. I turned the backyard into a garden again, not pristine or ornamental like before, but a working space, alive with herbs and soil and the flutter of bees. There was something healing in planting what would grow long after I was gone. The tomatoes were defiant, the rosemary stubborn. They reminded me of myself. One afternoon, as I was pruning the mint near the back fence, I heard footsteps. You never wore gloves, came a voice I hadn't heard in a decade. I turned slowly, Jenna. She looked older than I remembered, though not in the face. It was in the shoulders, the way she held her arms like armor. Her eyes were unreadable. I still don't, I said. Never liked the feel of fabric between me and the roots. She nodded, uncertain. I waited. Tina's gone back to Connecticut, she said eventually. She thought she'd get something, she didn't. I know. Silence. I don't know why I came. That's all right. She stepped forward, hesitating. The house smells the same, like basil and cedar. I hated that smell as a teenager. I remember. She looked around the garden. You planted again. It helps. Jenna's voice dropped. I believed everything they said about you. Dad, Tina, even Harper sometimes. I don't know why, maybe it was easier. I said nothing. Some of it, but not the parts that mattered. Jenna looked at the mint in my hands. Can I help? I nodded, and for the next hour we worked in silence, side by side. No grand apologies, no catharsis, just hands in the dirt, breath shared in the open air. That evening after she left, I sat on the back steps and watched the garden. Something about the stillness made the world feel tolerable. Not fair, not healed, but bearable. Growth had its own language. It didn't need permission. It just reached for the light anyway. The following weeks unfolded like soft pages. Jenna began coming by once a week, sometimes to help in the garden, sometimes just to sit. She didn't ask for explanations. I didn't offer them. Once she brought a photo album from a box she'd taken from Martin's study. We looked through it slowly. There I was in an old beach photo, laughing into the wind with both girls buried in the sand beside me. I don't remember this, she whispered. You were 6. She traced the edge of the image with her nail. You look like someone who belonged. I did for a while. Then she closed the book. I didn't need her to say more. Later, Dean Holloway called. He told me the scholarship fund had received its first 3 applicants. I cried after that call, not because of the fund, but because something I had imagined into being now existed in the world. It didn't matter who knew I'd created it. It just mattered that it was there. I began to feel like someone who could host her own life again. I accepted a lecture invitation at the local women's center. I started attending a poetry circle at the library. I bought new bedding. One morning, I received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single letter in Jenna's handwriting. Mom, I still don't know everything, maybe I never will, but I'm starting to realize that believing in someone doesn't always come before, it can come after. I see you now, I don't know if that's enough, but I hope it's a beginning. Love, Jenna. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my journal, not as proof, just as presence. By fall, the garden had taken over the fence line. Lavender bloomed defiantly near the mailbox. Neighbors I'd never met began waving from their porches, and the air, for the first time in years, smelled like something returning. I didn't need to win, I didn't need to be celebrated. I just needed a life that felt like mine. There was one room in the Charleston house I had avoided since the day I returned, the nursery, not because it hurt too much, but because I wasn't sure if it would hurt at all. I feared it might feel empty in the way a closet does when the season has changed, not with sorrow, but indifference. And indifference to me was the final erasure. But one Sunday morning, with the autumn sun barely breaking through the clouds, I stood in front of that door. My hand hovered on the knob. The house didn't protest, it waited. When I finally opened it, the air smelled faintly of cedar and something older, perhaps time itself. The wallpaper had faded, but the hand-painted clouds still floated above a row of bookcases. The crib was long gone, replaced by a twin bed with a floral cover, but I could still see the ghosts of stuffed animals in the corners, outlines of a mobile that once turned gently above. I sat on the edge of the bed, not to cry, not to remember, just to acknowledge. This room had once been filled with lullabies, and then with tantrums, and then with silence. And now it was a memory that had stopped asking for permission to stay. Later that afternoon, I found Harper waiting on the porch with a folded blanket in her arms. She had moved back to Charleston 2 months earlier, not into the house but nearby. She came often, not always to talk, sometimes just to be. Her presence had become something like breath, unnoticed until gone. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, handing me the blanket. Only memories, I replied, but they were kind today. She smiled and followed me into the house. We sat in the sunroom. The watercolor class had ended an hour before, and 2 women lingered behind to wash brushes and talk about grief. I didn't rush them. Harper looked at the paintings drying on the windowsill. That one's mine, she said, pointing to a blue and yellow landscape. I didn't mean it to be, but it looks like the lake near Nana's house. That's what happens, I said. We bleed through, even when we think we're only painting sky. She leaned her head back. Do you ever think about leaving again? Sometimes, I admitted. But the house knows me now, and I know it. There's something sacred about being seen by walls that never looked away. She didn't respond, she didn't need to. The silence was full enough. The days shortened, the garden prepared to sleep, and I moved slower, not from age, but from peace. I began writing again, not memoirs or essays, but letters I would never send. Letters to the girl I had been, to the woman I became, to the daughters I once lost and found again. One letter began, you thought you had to disappear to be free. But healing is not absence, it is presence patiently restored. I burned that letter in the fireplace and watched the smoke carry it back to the world. On the first snow of winter, Jenna brought over a rosemary wreath. We drank tea and didn't talk about the past. That was our truce, to live forward, not backward. When she left, she hugged me. It was not careful, it was whole. In February, the Scholarship Fund announced its first recipient, a 51-year-old woman named Marlene who had left a controlling marriage and enrolled in a community college nursing program. She wrote a letter. I kept it in my drawer, not for recognition, but for reminder. Every ending I had survived had become someone else's beginning. The funeral had been where they laughed, but the garden had been where I lived. The letters had been where I listened. The sunroom had been where I shared. And this house, with all its bruises and bloom, had become the quiet cathedral of my becoming. I didn't host reunions, I didn't post updates. I simply became a woman who had nothing left to prove, and therefore everything left to give. No final chapter, only a continuation. Because some stories don't end, they unfold. And some lives don't rise again in flames. They rise in gardens.